course, it's going to seem much easier to just keep doing what you're doing until it doesn't, until you have a heart attack, until you have a stroke, until you get cancer. Then suddenly you may overcome your addiction to meat and discover that you could do so without any symptoms of withdrawal. And so if there are any people in your life whom you love, it's contemptible to hurt yourself and hurt them because you think fried chicken is tasty. I mean, really, there's no excuse for that. Once you understand the obvious reality that eating animal products will likely shorten your life and cause you to incur all kinds of medical expenses and medical interventions, it's immoral to do that to your family and friends. Take yourself out of the equation for a moment. Whether you care about your own health or not is immaterial. You're punishing the people you love. It's a rotten thing to do to them. Normally, people don't want to hurt the people they love. Most people will do anything to not hurt the people they love. So why is it different with eating animals? Why are people willing to hurt their loved ones by giving themselves heart attack or dying young by eating meat? I'll tell you why. Because most often the people you love are also eating animals. And so you see how it works? Meat eaters effectively give each other permission to be horrible to each other, to punish each other, to give each other pain and suffering, because they're all making the same stupid mistake. And they're all making the same stupid mistake because in this culture, as in most cultures, it's considered normal to give yourself heart disease by eating dinner. Everyone does it. It's part of aging. People don't quit eating meat to protect their spouses and children because, after all, their spouses and children are also eating meat. Just like people wouldn't quit smoking to protect their spouses and children if their spouses and children were also smoking and they were all bumming cigarettes off each other all the time and living in secondhand smoke. This is how the meat industry has the country conned. Since meat eating is part of the culture, they run advertisements making eating meat more and more normal, showing healthy people eating meat, showing fit young men and women eating meat. And they underwrite research studies that fool people into thinking there's some health benefit to eating meat, or at least less harm that has been documented, or at least that there's some kind of controversy involved. They get the federal government to subsidize the cost of meat so they can advertise low prices for their meat, and they count on the reality that as long as people eat meat, few will figure out that they should give it up to protect their loved ones because their loved ones are killing themselves in the exact same way. It's quite a scam. It's subsidized, slow mass suicide. I just mentioned the subsidies for animal agriculture, and I'm sorry to have to point this out, but that's another reason why it's stupid to eat meat. Ask yourself, do you believe in capitalism or socialism? Now, in reality, all modern Western civilizations are a blend of both. In America, for example, most industries are capitalistic, but we have Social Security, which is socialist, and we have Medicare, which is socialist, and we have our public schools and police forces and armed forces, all of which are socialist. So there's always a blend. But for the most part, when we go out and buy products, those products are made by businesses that are capitalist enterprises. When you buy a toy or a book or a couch or a car, you're buying from a company that took a financial risk and produced a product and hopes to make a profit on the sale. That's capitalism. And most Americans agree that it's a far more efficient system of production than a socialist system of government-controlled manufacturing of goods. Most of us don't want the government publishing our books or manufacturing our cars. When you go out and buy an organically grown head of lettuce, or any organically grown fruits or vegetables, and usually even any fruits and vegetables that aren't organically grown, you're buying from farmers who risked their capital and their labor and grew a product, and they're hoping that your purchase will help make them whole, help make their farming operation profitable. This is especially true of smaller farms, and organic farms tend to be smaller. The average size of an organic farm is 285 acres, less than the average farm size, which is 444 acres. So if you want to help the small farmer, who's a legitimate, hardworking participant in the capitalist economy, buy their fruits and vegetables. And if you want to help the environment, buy organic. That way you'll also be helping farmers not risk their health with pesticides. But when you buy meat, you're buying a socialist product. They can't produce meat in this country competitively without taking advantage of federal government subsidies for the pesticide-ridden crops that they feed to their animals. Taxpayers foot the bill for almost 2/3 of the real cost of every product that the meat and dairy industry sells. A $4 cheeseburger would cost $11 without the subsidy. It's the worst kind of socialist enterprise, though, because while the government pays much of the cost, the profits don't go back to the government and the people. They go into private hands. So actually, it's not fair to socialism to call these enterprises socialistic. What's involved is an unholy blend of socialism and crony capitalism and a kleptocracy. Tax dollars being funneled into private hands. And what kinds of businesses are the meatpacking businesses and the fast food hamburger businesses that we subsidize? They are the businesses that far more than any other businesses in America use and abuse child labor and undocumented labor. Undocumented children as young as 13 are used to remove the pools of blood in the meatpacking plants, using harsh chemicals and working with sharp instruments on overnight shifts, dangerous work that Americans just don't want to do. McDonald's was just fined for employing over 300 children, including 10-year-olds. Packers Sanitation Services just had to pay a fine to the U.S. Department of Labor for using over 100 children ages 13 to 17 on overnight shifts and hazardous occupations. I'll bet there were hundreds more children that weren't discovered. Their fine was a measly $1.5 million, a rounding error to them, a minor business cost. Our taxpayer dollars create their profits, so effectively the fines are being paid with our tax dollars. Do you really want to give that evil 19th century child exploiting business your money? You're doing so every time you buy chicken or beef. I'm not a conspiracy theorist claiming that the government and the pharmaceutical industry and the medical industry are trying to make you fat and sick by subsidizing the animal agriculture industry. But if they did have the goal of making you fat and sick, they couldn't find any strategy more effective than subsidizing the animal agriculture industry, could they? You don't have to believe in conspiracies when they're openly subsidizing disease and death. There's nothing hidden about this. It's the one issue that Democrats and Republicans seem to agree upon. Both sides vote overwhelmingly to subsidize the industry that's killing us, because without those subsidies, the meat and dairy industries would die. Isn't it unfair to the hardworking organic vegetable farmer to have to compete with low-price meat subsidized by your tax dollars? If you were in the shoe business, risking your capital to try to create comfortable walking shoes, you'd be angry if some of the companies you were competing against received federal subsidies and could therefore lower their prices. That would be outrageous. There needs to be a fair playing field. But the food world is not fair. We have subsidized food, unhealthy meat and dairy, competing against non-subsidized food, healthy fruits and vegetables, competing for the same food dollars. That's a scam. And it's self-destructive for consumers to support that scam by giving their dollars to the subsidized industries that are taking advantage of them both as consumers and as taxpayers. So don't buy animal foods. It's that simple. I want to ask you, has anyone enjoyed the COVID-19 pandemic? I don't think so. All the sickness, all the death, all the tiresome debates about wearing masks and whether to get the vaccine and which vaccine to get and whether vaccines should be mandated at work and at school, all the divisions between Americans that the pandemic has only exacerbated, I think we can all agree that it's been a nightmare. I'd like to say that we're glad it's over, but it isn't really completely over, is it? COVID is still with us, still infecting people, on track to be responsible for over 100,000 deaths this year. And it will probably continue to infect our population for the rest of our lives. Almost all pandemics, including COVID, start with animals infecting humans, and it's usually because of animal agriculture. So if you want to prevent future pandemics, we need a global transformation to a vegan world. The purpose of nutrition is to sustain health, after all, so it's not too bright to create our food in a way that breeds disease. There has never been and never will be a zucchini pandemic. advantage plants. Antibiotics are, of course, an invaluable tool to fight infections and to save lives, but our toolkit of antibiotics, which has been a lifesaver for untold of millions during my lifetime, is starting to fail us. That's because of the growth of antibiotic resistance caused by the prolific use of antibiotics by the animal agriculture industry. The folly of eating animals, you see, is not only destroying our health, it's destroying our most vital medications. The very air we breathe is being assaulted every day by the animals we raise for slaughter. It's as if they're getting their revenge. We are being punished with heat waves and droughts and floods and hurricanes and tornadoes that are far more severe than such events have ever been in recorded human history. And that's the result, too, of the animals we raise for slaughter. How can that be? Isn't climate change caused by the burning of fossil fuels? Yes, of course, the burning of fossil fuels contributes to climate change, but it contributes to far less greenhouse gas warming than does animal agriculture. Methane, not carbon dioxide, is the gas that is responsible now for the greatest acceleration in climate warming. The EPA monitors methane and recently produced an action plan to deal with it, in which they said that the leading industrial cause of methane emissions is the oil industry. That's because of the methane leaks from oil and gas fields, which are indeed a terrible problem that needs fixing. The EPA then claimed that the second leading cause of industrial cause of methane emissions is landfills. But their own data contradicts them. In their own chart of the causes of methane emissions, 27% comes from enteric fermentation, the process of digestion in ruminant animals, including cows, that leads to the belching of methane. 10% comes from the manure of farmed animals. So they split the cow, putting the front end of the cow in second place and the back end of the cow in fourth place, because when you put the cow back together and add up the second place and fourth place contributions, the front end and the back end contributions of the cow, animal agriculture becomes the leading industrial cause of methane pollution in the world. And methane, after all, is now the leading driver of climate warming. The EPA simply could not admit that animal agriculture is the biggest part of the problem because they have no plan to address it. So they solve their PR problem by splitting the cow. Each cow in the world belches about 220 pounds of methane per year. The instantaneous global warming potential of methane is about 130 times as powerful as that of carbon dioxide. We have about 1.5 billion cows in the world. There's also the methane from sheep and goats and from animal manure. A molecule of methane in the atmosphere causes the same amount of heating whether it comes from a cow or a leaky gas pipeline. But so far, I've talked only about direct emissions. The reason that animal agriculture is the leading cause of climate change goes beyond direct emissions. Viewing the greenhouse gas problem as only a direct emissions problem is once again a failure of the imagination. Any serious accounting of greenhouse emissions takes into account carbon opportunity cost, which is to say it takes into account land use. Carbon opportunity cost is the carbon sequestration benefit you forfeit by choosing one option over another. When we choose to burn forests in order to graze cattle, we forfeit the carbon dioxide sequestration we would have gained from the trees that we stupidly burned. At the same time, of course, we get the direct emissions from the forest burning. A published peer-reviewed study that took into account carbon opportunity costs estimated that animal agriculture is responsible for at least 87% of greenhouse gases. That study did not take into account animal respiration or the carbon kicked up from the ocean floors by trawling operations, or the effects of diminished sea forests and phytoplankton populations caused by industrial fishing, or the emissions from pasture maintenance fires set on grazing land all over the world to accommodate grazing. So if these factors were to be included, we might find that animal agriculture is responsible for far more than 87% of greenhouse gases. Imagine some acreage that was covered with trees, and those trees are burned to create grazing land. Cows are transported to that land in trucks that burn fuel, and then the cows graze the grass and degrade the soil, which now sequesters less carbon. To account for the greenhouse gases involved, you'd have to begin with all the carbon released into the atmosphere by the clearing of the land. And then you have to factor in carbon opportunity cost, all the carbon that would have been sequestered if we had left the trees alone. You have to account for all the carbon that would have been sequestered in the healthy, rich soil before we burnt down the trees and let the cows graze the land and diminish the soil. Then there's the belch methane from the cow's enteric fermentation and the methane from the manure. If the cow is also grain-fed, then there's the emissions from all the inputs involved in the growing and transporting of the grain, including from the nitrous oxide resulting from the production of the fertilizer, 300 times as powerful a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. The grain fed to cows, like corn and soil, are usually heavily sprayed with pesticides. Then there's the carbon dioxide that the cow exhales with every breath. And then there's transporting the cows to slaughter, and then the meat has to be frozen and transported. Then when you eat the meat, sometimes you have to factor in the ambulance that takes you to the hospital. It's a climate nightmare every which way to grow and slaughter cows. Or humans could eat the corn and the soy directly, and what would happen? We'd have 10 times as much food. We could do away with the pesticides. We wouldn't have to burn the trees and the vegetation to accommodate grazing, so they could be allowed to grow and sequester carbon dioxide and build up carbon in the soil. With no cows in the equation, there'd be no methane generated out of either half of the cow, and there'd be no cow exhaling carbon dioxide. We wouldn't have to transport any cows, and we wouldn't need any ambulance rides to the hospital. Our food could be helping the environment instead of hurting it. Fossil fuel burning, whether for transportation or manufacturing or energy, doesn't begin to compare to animal agriculture in terms of climate heating because there's little carbon opportunity cost involved. The leading cause of deforestation